Bob Dylan. At this march, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
3 months after the march, President Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson took over the presidency. He pushed for the Civil Rights Act to be passed quickly. In June of 1964, the filibuster ended. The bill was passed with the support of both parties. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 included these major provisions. Title I banned the use of different voting standards for blacks and whites. Title II prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. Title VI allowed the withholding of federal funds from programs that practice discrimination. Title VII banned discrimination based on race, sex, religion, or national origin by employers and unions. How did minorities' role in the workplace and government change after the Civil Rights Movement?
It kind of went through a little bit of a, well, from my perspective, I was born in 1879, so I missed it about 10, 12 years there, but probably my biggest, what I know or have experienced, it seemed to be kind of slow growing, and then you got to the 80s and there was more of what you call affirmative action and trying to get more people hired in upper level programs and government positions, for better or worse. Sometimes it seems like since they've kind of repealed some of that stuff, that in some capacities you, at least at the government level, might have even more people involved now. I mean, certainly in the last, you look at even the presidential administrations in the last 10, 15 years with Condoleezza Rice involved and Colin Powell. It seems to be more diversity, at least at the executive branch. The legislative branch, that's still growing. That gets a little bit better. Nowadays, they seem to focus more so on women, more women being to elected office, not as much the elected component. I don't know if people would have guessed that we would have had an African-American president when we did. I think there's some people that thought they'd never see that in their lifetime. As far as, cities and mayors, I think that's where a lot of the bigger impact would be, and I don't know if you have as much of that. I mean, some of the major cities have had minorities, but I've always felt that local government and state government, to me, has a bigger impact on people's lives. And so I would think that would be where it'd be most beneficial. I mean, it's certainly nice to have a minority president, but as far as you and I in our day-to-day existence, might not have as big of an impact as someone at a lower level, so to speak, of power. So I think it's gotten better. There's always room for improvement, for sure.
In the South, many blacks still had trouble voting. In protest, Martin Luther King Jr. and some 25,000 other people would march from Selma to Montgomery. State troopers charged into the crowd with whips, clubs, and tear gas. Many viewers saw this on TV and were shocked by the violence. President Johnson sent National Guard members to protect the protesters. In response to the march, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was eventually passed.
How did the public react to Congress passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
Well, what had happened was we saw television come into American households on a large scale, and it allowed people to see kind of truly what was going on, and that's why the decade of the 1960s was so turbulent. It was probably a decade that had more cultural conflict than most decades in the United States. And it was people seeing what was truly happening. It was people getting the visual images in their houses on television of what was happening. And people started really considering, well, what is America truly about? We can go back to the time period of the first black flag in World War II, or before that we can go all the way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, where we saw the equal contributions of all members of society. But how do we value them? You have to really look at, in general terms, just what does society want. And as society continues to evolve, and perhaps that's what makes the United States the greatest country in the world, is that this form of government that we have is a government by the people, for the people, of the people. And the people can change. The government doesn't change things, people change the government, and we've changed our policies. And when the Voting Rights Act was passed, or when we have the Civil Rights Act that was passed, it was essentially the people forcing the change upon the government, and people reacted, for the most part, split to it, but there was more of a majority that were in favor of equal rights going to everybody, and I think that's why the act passed.
The 24th Amendment was also another legal landmark. It outlawed poll taxes, which were mainly used in the South to prevent poor African Americans from voting. Were there any minority groups that were not in favor of equal rights?
As far as what I've studied and read, I don't know if they're not in favor, but I wonder if sometimes if you were Latino in the 50s or 60s, if you felt like the change that you were trying to get was overshadowed by the African American movement. Or you talk about even some of the migrant workers out in western parts of the U.S., whether it be Hispanic migrant workers or your Asian migrant workers up in the Northwest, if they felt somehow like they were overshadowed by what was going on in the South and the Southeast. If you consider women a minority group, sometimes they felt like they weren't included in that movement. I mean, particularly women within the African American civil rights groups were still treated like lesser citizens and not as active. And they're like, okay, you can be a secretary, but we're not going to really pay attention to you in a leadership position. So even within the movement, you have like sub-movements that were going on and trying to get their voices heard as well.
Black nationalism was the belief in separate identity and racial unity in the African American community. After being released from jail, Malcolm X spent 12 years as a minister for the Nation of Islam, which spread the belief of black nationalism. He was against integration and nonviolence at first. Later, in 1964, he left the Nation of Islam and went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. After seeing many races worshiping peacefully together, he had a change in his beliefs. Upon returning to the U.S., he worked with other civil rights leaders to unify the movement. But 9 short months later, he was shot to death in February 1965. 3 members from the Nation of Islam were charged with murder. In 1966, a new militant political party was formed by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. They were called the Black Panthers. They used violence to get their message across. Many riots broke out between the police and protesters. This violence left many people injured and some even dead. How did the civil rights movement wrap up?
Well, some would say it's not done. In fact, I saw last night in the news they were talking about that the Supreme Court was questioning whether or not the Voting Rights Act in the 60s should still be going on, because they have to renew it every once in a while and should be allowed to expire. And they had a series of protesters out there, and the question does become, have we gotten to the point that we want to get to? I mean, there's still pay differentiation. We have new minority groups nowadays. Some people would say the illegal immigration issue and border patrol is still a civil rights issue. So I don't know, if you're looking at the African American civil rights, I suppose you could say in some capacity it wraps up about the mid-70s, but I would argue it's not really done. And I think a lot of people within, like, especially the NAACP would say it's never going to be over.
Mark.
I think the civil rights movement is about equality between African Americans and the whites in this country.
It's about people fighting for what they believe in.
African Americans wanting to be treated like white people.
Minorities wanted the same rights as white people.
African Americans wanted to be able to use the same public places as whites.
It's about the integration of African American people in the country.
I think it was about how blacks, though, even though they got their freedom from slavery, they were still being repressed and just kind of discriminated against just the color of their skin. So they wanted their rights, just like the women did.